Ahoy! Around Christmas last year I talked about the potential new weapon, and since then I have somewhat changed my mind about it. So the weapon that I primarily talked about was the Celestial Gauntlet, essentially a Life Staff 0.1 that got reworked into the Life Staff, and in the process of that quite a few things had been changed as well. And I gotta be honest, I was kind of excited about finding all that old footage of the Celestial Gauntlet, and I think that kind of made my brain go more in the direction of, hey, maybe this is also the weapon that we were getting. But recently I've been thinking more about this, and while I've mentioned some of the points I will repeat here in that video back then, I realized that some of the things that are more important to the New World devs these days, from what we know, do not quite match with this particular playstyle, this weapon anymore. So the first thing that I think is very important for the New World dev these days is that the weapons have to have a unique identity. We can see that in everything they do pretty much. They want to have some level of novelty in everything they create, and they want to keep things exciting and unusual, at least to some degree, so that you always have something completely new to try out that feels really good when you use it. And we could especially see that, for example, with the introduction of the Greatsword. Now, we already have two magical gauntlets in the game. We have the Ice Gauntlet and we have the Void Gauntlet. Both of these weapons work fairly differently, so it's not necessarily like they have the same identity, especially with the Void Gauntlet also having the Void Blade, which makes it significantly more different. But I don't think that adding another gauntlet into that gauntlet would exactly be a unique identity, especially when the Void Gauntlet is already a healer assisting focus scaling weapon, to some degree at least. We know that the next weapon is going to be a focus weapon, and it's focused on healing, buffing, and being some form of support class. This is something the devs have said, so it's not going to be daggers. I know some people are speculating about that again for some reason. It is going to be something else, unless you think we're getting healing daggers. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the more likely weapon of the possible ones is probably the mace. The mace is a weapon that we know has been worked on to some form, and I think it fits much better with the concept of being a unique weapon. There's also another reason why I think the mace is a particular relevant option here, and that is the complete lack of strike damage currently. So one of the reasons why I was thinking about this whole scenario is because I was going through my elemental version stuff, I was going through that entire video and how to gear, and I was thinking about the different sources of damage that you usually take. And we have a bunch of different elemental damage sources depending on the weapon or hard rune you're getting hit by. Whereas on the physical side is overwhelmingly slash damage, unless you're going into single target territory where it's a lot of thrust damage, but not a lot of strike damage. Obviously there is the hammer with a lot of strike damage, and there are some outlier abilities, like Spear has a strike damage ability, Greatsword has a strike damage ability, but it's just a very niche scenario. And with the Warhammer's damage output being nerfed, we have even less strike damage in the game. So adding a mace to this game would very much add to this pressure of having this damage source to some degree and having people gear around it somewhat. Now the somewhat confusing thing about this is that a mace weapon that would deal strike damage wouldn't necessarily strike me as a support weapon, and they have clearly said it's for healing, for buffing, and for a support class. So I'm not entirely sure how that will fit together, but it still seems more logical to me than other options, unless the mace is something they want to release after the daggers, and it's something that we would not see for years down the road, but that again would be very weird, because then we would not really see any strike damage until then. Baggins also had an interesting idea back then about a spellbook. He thought that maybe the new weapon would be a spellbook, but we don't really have any data mining of that, so different from the mace that has been in the files in various ways, there isn't really anything about a spellbook. It was just pure speculation. So what I'm thinking though is that there's still a possibility for that to be the case if the healer support weapon that we're getting, because it also scales with focus, is somewhat segmented like the Void Gauntlet, for example, is, where you have a more damage focused part that scales with int, and then you have a more healing focused part that scales with focus. So maybe you can actually hold the mace, and you have an offhand that could go in the shield slot, that could be a spellbook. And if that was the case, then the spellbook could, for example, deal either arcane or lightning damage. Both of those aren't used. Arcane we already have detonate, so it would kind of play into existing damage more, whereas lightning damage would just make it harder to counter that, and you would have to gear more around that. So I think there are interesting options in how exactly this could be put together, but generally I think that this makes the mace more likely than the Celestial Gauntlet. There was also, I know, some speculation about the shield being included with the mace. I think this could technically be possible, but it does seem odd on the basis that it's supposed to be a focus weapon, and I feel like if we had a mace with a shield, that would be very far from a supportive and focus weapon. That would just seem like a tank damage focused weapon. So I don't really think that would fit together. It could also be a two-handed mace, but the same thing there. That looks like a damaged weapon to me. That doesn't seem like something that would be used primarily for healing or buffing. What I'm hoping is whatever form this takes, speaking of shields as well, is that they include the AoE shield effect from back then somehow that allowed you to stop projectiles in their tracks. So that wasn't really a shield you hold in your hands, that was a shield bubble around you, which I thought was a really cool feature. So maybe a more nerfed version of that, maybe a slowdown projectile option or something, would in my eyes be very cool. Of course, it is worth keeping in mind that all of these files from way back in the day that were data mined or that were found from old test versions are so old that of those people that worked on the game back then, there may not be many left working on it now. So the vision may have completely shifted, and with the vision shifting, the weapons may also have changed. They may have completely changed their mind about what kind of weapons they want to release. So maybe it's not a mace after all, at all, and something completely different. But I do think that a mace would be an enjoyable weapon, and it fits with the strike damage, and a lot of people want a mace in the game. So while it's not as in demand as a dagger, I think it would be a good fit, and I wouldn't see much of a reason not to include it unless they have something much cooler. It'll probably still be quite a while until we find out. I'm thinking they're not going to tell us much earlier than the expansion itself, so we get super hyped for it. And it's going to be funny to see if it actually ends up being the Celestial Gauntlet, and I made this entire case against that, saying it's going to be a mace. But I am more leaning towards the mace now than I am towards the Celestial Gauntlet, even though maybe we'll see some pieces of that, some ability parts from back then implemented in some form. In the next days, we'll be talking about Elemental Aversion versus Shirking Fort. We'll talk about stamina regeneration back in the day. We'll have tons of things to talk about, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you're interested in that. Also, let me know in the comments what you think the next weapon will be or how exactly it will work. I think there could be some interesting theories here. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.